in Exodus today. It's a book which is all about God's salvation for His people. And that one word, salvation, a lot of people have trouble with that word today. Maybe the church doesn't have so much trouble with it, but a lot of people do. Salvation, opaque at best, offensive at worst. There's the Hallmark card version of salvation, the idea that people get to go to heaven after they die. But Exodus gives us a much bigger picture, much more richly nuanced meaning of the word salvation. We learned salvation is, one of the things we learn about salvation in the book of Exodus is that it is liberation. Liberation, all about how God intervenes in our lives to liberate us from things which enslave us, which kill us. So salvation is God's liberating activity in our lives. Because, if we build our identity on anything rather other than God, something that we invest more into than God, it becomes an enslaving force to us. God intervenes in order to liberate. Oh, what does liberation mean? I mean, it's also fraught with lots of political meaning even today. What does it mean? It sounds wonderful even, though, in theory. But how does it actually work? I mean, really, in real life, on the ground, in my life, in your life, our life together, what does it look like? And how do we live free? There's New Hampshire has a slogan, live free or die. And it's salvation language. What does Exodus mean by salvation, liberation? How do we get God's liberating power working in practical ways in our life? And we really can't do any better than going and spending time in the book of Exodus for this, even especially here in Exodus chapter 16. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time here, but in order to get our bearings straight, just want to remind everybody where we are. The people of Israel have already crossed the Red Sea, and on the other side of the sea there, they had this really wonderful song. And Hollywood, has turned this kind of thing into a big production. And this song of liberation on the other side of the sea. Pharaoh's army has just been dashed away. So they've got this dopamine high, a victory over enemies, and a great celebration in their song. Let me sing unto the Lord, for he surged, horse and rider, he hurled into the sea. And they're singing the song, and Miriam, Aaron's sister, and the other women after her have taken timbrels in hand and are dancing and singing. And you can feel it. Just put yourself right in there in that moment, and you can feel the great release of fear that had gripped you up to that moment. It's all fallen away now, and there's this rise of euphoria. It's such joy. So there, you can only do that for so long. Exodus tells us they left there, they journeyed onward, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days into the wilderness, and they found no water. And they came to Marah, which means bitter, because the waters were bitter. And the Lord showed Moses a tree, which he flung into the water, and the water turned sweet. And then they left that place, and they moved on and camped at another place called Elim. And there was an oasis there. It's an oasis in the desert. Nice little miniature version of the Garden of Eden in the wilderness. And they stayed there for a while before they journey onward. And they come to the wilderness of Sin, this is where we find ourselves in Exodus chapter 16. And with Elim behind them, they come to the wilderness of Sin. And, if you've ever read Lord of the Rings, this sounds a little bit like Sam and Frodo on their way to Mount Doom. Except we're in the Bible. And in Hebrew, the wilderness of Sin is really, it's better to translate it, I think, as the wilderness of Sin. That's what it is in the Hebrew. Wilderness of Sin. As in, I have seen wilderness. And maybe you've seen the wilderness. Isn't everybody convinced that it's right here where we live anyway? Wilderness. wilderness of Sin is right here, isn't it? For a lot of people, it's right here. A lot of us think that's where we live. A lot of people know that's where I am at. You spent time there, haven't you? Some of you are in it now. You're painfully aware of the geography. You know the landmarks, the climate, the heat, the cold, every painful detail of emptiness, and lack, and barrenness. And every wild animal ready to pounce and bite and sting. Exodus says it's there, in between the oasis of Elim and Mount Sinai on the other side, out there in the middle of nowhere, where evil itself has its domain. And they find themselves there, halfway through the second month, a month and a half after leaving Egypt, and reality has finally fallen heavily upon them. There's all the euphoria, all the joys gone. There's nothing to eat. They're out of food. You can feel the growing anxiety, the fear. And all the community of Israelites murmured against Moses, says the Exodus, and against Aaron in the wilderness. Everybody. And would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt when we sat by flesh pots. Those flesh pots. Who doesn't love a good flesh pot? I mean, really. Who doesn't? I love good stew. I love pot roast. You know, that's good stuff. Stew meat with potatoes and carrots and onion. You know, there's Jason Davis, and emblazoned across his trailer as he drives up the road is Jason's flesh pots. Everybody wants to have a bite of his food. You know, it's so good. And you know what you do. I mean, some of you have done this, haven't you? Before coming to church on Sunday, you put a pot roast in the oven, put it on a low heat. It cooks long and slow, so that when you come home, bringing friends along with you, there it is. It's all ready to be served. Put it on the table. Those are the good times. Israel remembers the good times. And here they are in the wilderness of sin. They see themselves right here in the middle of the worst of it all. And they're in it, up to their necks in trouble, deeply vulnerable to the danger all around. And maybe you, like them, have seen this wilderness. It's bad. There is no glowing black, there's no glowing, we have the advantage of wherever we are, no matter anywhere, practically anywhere you go. There's always somewhere this glowing yellow sign out there in the distance somewhere. You squint your eyes, you look at it closely. There's the Dollar General. It's right out there. You can see it glowing in the distance, 3 miles out that way. Dollar General. But they didn't have one of those. It's going bad because there's no food. They aren't going to be able to survive without food. Not even 2 months out of Egypt. And this is where it all ends. And just like that, Egypt becomes the good old days. Let's go, if we could only go back to the good old days where things were better. Anything would be better than where we are. And they're thinking, we've made a mistake. We're following after the wrong king. Pharaoh, he's the better king. Enslavement to Pharaoh is better than this. In the crisis of the present, their lives are on the line. People are going to die. And they would gladly give up their freedom for a pot of stew. Who doesn't long for the good old days? I hear people talk about the good old days. And for us who are older, what are the good old days? What, the 1960s, 70s, and 80s? I don't know, 1960s and 70s? 1950s, 1960s, 1980s? 70s? The good old days? Really? I mean, you've forgotten a lot of stuff, haven't you? There's a lot of stuff that was going wrong back then. A lot of stuff going wrong. There was a lot of wrong stuff going on. It wasn't the good old days, but we forget all that. 6 weeks out or so, Egypt, they've already forgotten Egypt. They've forgotten the Egyptians, putting them to hard work at crushing labor and how they made their lives bitter. They'd already forgotten all that. And God, hearing their moaning, God remembering his covenant with Abraham, and God coming and saving them, they've forgotten all of that. Forgotten the Lord had done for them at the Red Sea. They don't remember the bitter waters of Morton just a few days earlier, or weeks earlier, how the Lord had sweetened those waters for them. Oh, what that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt when we sat by the flesh pots. Jason knows how to make a really good barbecue. Oh, I wish we had Jason's barbecue. He's doing chickens now. Oh, I wish I had some of that chicken. Oh, that we had died by the Lord's hand. And what does liberation mean when you're left to die in the wilderness? I mean, it sounds wonderful in theory, what is what? I mean, we're surrounded by surrounded by impossibility. How does liberation work there? What does it actually look like? We're surrounded by impossibility today. All sorts of things that we just cannot we extract ourselves from. Our lives are full of impossibility. If you want to learn a little bit about liberation, salvation, this freedom that's ours, then we can't really do any better than spending some time in Exodus. You, Moses, Aaron, brought us out into this wilderness. It's your fault. Now that's a good one, because there's a little bit of truth in that in there. Moses, probably, it's their fault. And these men, they refused to stop for directions. They couldn't be bothered to pull over and just ask for directions. If his wife had been at the wheel driving down the road, he would have. This wouldn't have happened. She would have pulled over and asked for directions on the way somewhere. But no, men are doing this. They're in charge of this. So Moses, Aaron, you did this to us. Except we're reading, this isn't our story. This is Exodus. And in the book of Exodus, they're not lost. In the book of Exodus, no one took a wrong turn. In the story, Israel has crossed over the Red Sea into the wilderness because of whom? Who led them there? God has guided them there. God has brought them there, appearing in a pillar of cloud and fire, taking them straight into God-forsakenness. And they're there because God has led them there. That's why they're there. So we're confronted with this fact here in Exodus 16. The reason they're there in that place where they find no food, and later in Exodus 17, they're in that place where they find no water. The reason why they find themselves there in that awful place, in that hard place, in that uncomfortable place, dangerous place, life-threatening place, God has put them there. It's part of the journey that they're on, and God is taking them on. Liberated from slavery, yes. Taken out of the land of slavery with a promised land of milk and honey, only 11 days' journey away. And they spend 40 years there, wandering around in the wilderness. A place that's hostile to life. Why? Why would that be? And the answer to the question begins to emerge here in the story. And all the community of the Israelites murmured and complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. It's recorded no less than it's 4 times. They complained against Aaron and Moses. And I get it. I understand that complaint because it's me. I get it. It's a fair gripe. I think it's a fair gripe. It's not only a justified gripe, a complaint. It's correct. God has brought them out there in order to kill them. When they were in Egypt, compelled under the lash, they hated it. They hated their life in Egypt. They were miserable. Now they're free and they've been liberated, and they're thinking about how good they had it back, but thinking about how good it was back in Egypt and remembering it so fondly now, so desirable, wanting to go back. You know who else does that kind of stuff? Addicts do that kind of stuff. This is the language of addiction. When you're addicted and you're going through withdrawal, there's nothing, you can't think of anything else. It's just more miserable. And the addiction is so strong, and you think yourself back into the addiction. You think back into the situation with delusional thinking that screens out all the misery that was there, and it wasn't really so bad. And you want to go back to that desperately. Free now, you're no longer slaves, yet in your hearts and your spirits inside you, a longing for Egypt, because you were still slaves. You were still slaves. So yes, Israel, you were right. God has brought you out into the desert to kill you. God has brought you out into the wilderness in order for it to be the death of you, for your hunger to be the hospice through which God would kill off your old selves, your enslavement. That you recall the bondage of Pharaoh so fondly is proof that you're still not yet free. So God brings you into the desert for a different kind of deliverance, a further act of salvation. That's what liberation looks like. But God is gentle, and here God is kind, and God is gracious, and God does not chastise them. He answers their nostalgia for Egypt's stew pots by upping the ante and giving them quail every evening and bread every morning. They begrudged him their deliverance, and yet God feeds them. In the evening at twilight, God gives them abundance of food and covers their camp. And God in the morning gives them bread to eat. Every day, a two-part message. One, lose your illusions about Egypt. And two, the Lord your God. I am the Lord your God, not Pharaoh. I mean, if you had been at bed and breakfast and writing a review of your experience at the bed and breakfast online, quail covered the camp. Every evening, fancy five-star fare. And every morning under the dew of the desert, the opposite of extravagance, just enough food for the day. Bread in the Bible isn't fancy food. Bread in the Bible is a reminder of our failure, our sin. Adam and Eve distrust God in the garden, disobey God's teaching. And as they leave the Garden of Eden, God's parting words to Adam are, because you have disobeyed by the sweat of your brow, you shall eat bread until you die. Before all that, before their disobedience, they ate fruit in the garden. They didn't eat bread. But now they're eating bread. It becomes a reminder, a kind of a sacrament of their drinking from God in the garden. Bread requires a lot of work, a lot of effort. Harvesting and grinding and mixing and kneading and rising and waiting and folding and rising and waiting and folding and baking. At least that's what I'm told. Bread is work, a reminder of the marks of sin. God gives it to them, though, as a sign of grace. And it's God's doing. It's there for them to receive. God has delivered them from Pharaoh, yes, delivered them from into the desert of sin in order to undo their captivity to sin, in order to undo our failure to trust God's promise, that, in order to bring us back to himself in order to learn that we can trust God. So these grumblers in the desert, they're right. God has brought them out there to kill them, to exterminate the old untrusting Adam. God has gotten them out of Egypt, and now in the wilderness of sin, God is getting the Egypt out of them. Israel hasn't yet learned how to be free. They still perceive the world through the eyes of their enslavement. They still think and behave and act like slaves. The Promised Land, only 11 days' journey from Egypt, 11 days from slavery to freedom, but the Israelites cannot get there. It's going to take them 40 years. They want rapid transportation to get them quickly to the other side of the desert. They need formation and education and counseling and training. You can get people out of Egypt in an instant, but you can't get Egypt out of the people except through a long process. Yes, they're cranky with a serious case of munchies and ungrateful as all get out, but the Israelites, they're right. God has led them there into the wilderness of sin in order to kill them. The conflict, the trouble, the resistance between a former way of life where we must save ourselves and a new emerging way of life grounded in grace, but not knowing what it is really, not understanding it really. Just it feels like dying. We're prone to sabotage this work that God is doing in us because it's so painful. And so we're prone to want to go back into slavery and just short circuit the whole thing and just leave it behind us. But it's in this trouble, in this pain and suffering where we learn to access in our hearts this new thing that God has given us, what we know with our heads, but not in our hearts. Where we work out what we believe in principle into actuality on the ground, where we put bone and muscle and will into this thing, and we know it not just with our heads, but with our hearts and with every fiber in our being. That's we can be zapped. Yes, that would be great. We can be liberated just like that. But it's a long, arduous process that makes what is true, makes what is true a thing that we know with our lives. It's the trouble, the wilderness, where this stuff gets figured out, where it gets habituated into us, gets honed and tested and realized. It happens through wilderness training. It happens through facing the hard things. This present suffering, it happens through difficult things. We're tempted, the memory of Egypt grows fair. Becomes a place to which we want to return. How does liberation work in our lives? My life? What does it actually look like? We can't do it. We can't do any better than by looking right here to Exodus. We like technology. We like technique. We like pills. We like things that do things to us. We like quick fixes that allow the illusion of everything is all right. But we aren't robots, and we're not tools. And you are not a thing, an object to be manipulated and controlled. You are an individual, a human being, a person, living, breathing. You are someone who's got to cooperate. You're someone who's got to participate. You are someone who's got to commit and invest your life in this. I mean, what are you going to do with that faith of yours? Offer this to you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Let's pray. Our gracious God, most merciful and kind, living in the wilderness of sin as we do, we are tempted to listen to the voices of Egypt. We go to our phones, to our streaming feeds, to our TVs. And there are many voices ready and very willing and eager to have us follow them, to listen to them. And we are tempted. And we listen to these voices and we allow them to take us places. And we're taken into other ways and other ideologies that supersede you and your way. Protect us, Lord, from this temptation. Protect us, Lord, from our propensity to sabotage ourselves and to go these other ways. May we not lose sight, Lord. May our ears always be attuned to you. That our life and give witness to you as the way, and thus the truth and the life. May your voice be the one that captures us and raises us into new life. And give us the wisdom and courage to know and do what is good and right. Give us clear eyes, clear vision and sight, that we may see clearly your truth. And guide us out of our fear and our anxiety and feed us. Feed us, Lord, your word. And nourish us there, Lord. And fill our hearts with our lives with a sense of your presence among us. May there be joy in knowing that you are Lord and not Pharaoh. And so now, Lord, we pray as you taught us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. And give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and power,